Warning, warning, your fish you just added are too aggressive. I repeat, they're too aggressive. They're fin nipping and being super aggressive. What do you do?
So today is a new segment called Fish Tank Emergencies. And today's segment is about fish aggression. So stay tuned. Hey everyone, welcome. My name's Dan Connor with Aquarium Insider. This is the Aquarium Insider podcast. And today I'm excited as I was coming up with some ideas for some podcasts. I wanted to talk about some things I hear in the store a lot and questions I feel like I answer daily. And I wanted to talk about what do you do when you buy a new fish and it's too aggressive, right? No matter what kind of fish you have, you could have these issues. So I wanted to talk about that, and I figured I'd name the segment Fish Tank Emergencies. Shout out Aquafunk will help with that. It's a good idea. So I'm kind of running with it. All right. So we'll start with you have a tank. It doesn't matter what kind of tank. You have a tank. You bought it. You said you got some fish. You're like, man, I need to add some new fish to this tank. And then you add new fish, and all of a sudden it throws your whole tank balance off. You got fish chasing each other. You got fin nippers in your aquarium. What do? All right. So today, let's go ahead and let's jump right in and start breaking down the causes, right? Like why they're doing it, and then some ways to handle it. And I wanted to break it down, I think, in 3 segments, or 3 groups for this podcast, right? It's not the same for every type of fish. So I think, and we're going to talk generalities here for a little bit, because it could be different depending on each fish, right? Each fish is always going to be a little bit different. I like to say I apply the 80-20 rule, and then if you have outliers, you have to leave some wiggle room for adjustments, if that makes sense, right? All right. So I think we're going to break this down into what do you do when you have community fish that are being too aggressive, mostly like your fin nippers, right? What do you do in an African cichlid tank, right? Because the cichlid tanks are going to create, their sort of pecking order or whatever. How do you deal with that? And then lastly, I think your New World or your Central and South Americans, stuff like that, I think they have a different. It's very similar to Africans, but it's a slightly different in my opinion. And we're going to talk about the differences between all 3 today. So let's go ahead and start with the community fish one, right? Let's start with that one. All right. So a more general tip that's going to cover all 3 of these, I have to stress at the beginning, is do your research before you add a fish. I don't think anybody should go to your local fish store and just go there and buy something willy-nilly. I think you should do a little research on that fish to make sure it goes well with your fish. Ask your fish store for advice on if that would go well with your tank. I think that's also okay, as long as they have the knowledge, I hope. But do your own, fact check it, check yourself, ask some people in some forums and some groups. There's plenty of them out there. So do that, then go look for that fish and then add it. I think you'll be a lot more successful. Because like I said in the last podcast, my entire reason for this podcast is to make fish keeping stress-free, cost-effective, right? And less work. I'm not trying to sit there and make this more difficult, but I think doing a little due diligence in the front end is going to pay its dividends in the back end, I promise. So let's just start with that and see how we go, okay? All right, so let's talk about community fish. You get some fin nippers you've added some barbs or something like that. What do you do in this case? And I wanted to go through a couple ideas. First off, remember that even if you research, by the way, a few things, there's always going to be outliers to this. There's no 100% foolproof on virtually anything in the hobby. So you could research this fish and it would be great and it goes well. And then you get that one fish that has that different behavior trait, or it's just acting differently, and it's just going to terrorize your tank, right? There's not a whole lot you can do about that. And we'll talk about what to do with the nuisance fish later, or the bullies, or whatever you want to call them, right? So for now, let's talk about some things we can do. So when you're looking to get fish out of your aquarium, make sure, I guess the easiest way to describe this is make sure you're feeding your fish enough and the right foods, I guess, is a good idea, right? So keeping your fish fed often, right? So let's talk about what's best practices for that. And this is to make sure you're not causing any unprovoked need for food, right? You're providing it. It's relatively easy for them to get, and they're not having to fight over every crumb. Now, mind you, I'm not telling you to overfeed your tank, because that's even worse. but feeding the right amount, something they can eat within 30 to 45 seconds. Optimally, it would be twice a day, right? Once in the morning, maybe before you leave for work or school, and then in the afternoon when you get home, that's when you're going to want to watch your tanks anyway. Feed then too, right? So that's a good point. And then make sure you're feeding the right food for the right fish. And a lot of the times it's relatively simple, right? We can feed some omnivores type tropical flake or some micro wafers for your community fish. And that's, so just an idea, that's kind of what we feed here. So we'll feed micro wafers from Hikari for a lot of our community fish. And then we might mix in some tropical flake here and there. But typically those two things are a good food that we like to feed them, right? So it's a good food, and we're feeding them enough to where they can eat it within under a minute, and then we're feeding them at least twice a day. So I think that's a good rule of thumb to kind of go by here. All right, next. For community fish, I don't know how I want to say this. I think it's nice that you have more decor and plants in your tank for this, because my experience is if you have fish that are aggressive, right? They're fin nippers. They could be in there nipping fins for a few reasons. One, I hope they're not super territorial. A few might be. Keeping things that breaks the fish's, in my opinion, line of sight. I mean, it can see it the whole time. They can go duck behind something and go around something. I think helps a lot as far as that being one minor solution to what could fix your problem, having some more decor. And when I say decor, I'm not talking about caves and stuff things go hide in. I'm talking about just things that go up in your tank, like plants and maybe some driftwood and stuff that doesn't create a lot of small hiding places. I think that could be tricky. It depends on the fish, but I think in just generally speaking, maybe some long pieces of solid driftwood like Malaysian driftwood, plants, things like that, all help kind of break this sort of line of sight when fish are going to start getting aggressive and, fin nippy around everything else, right? And also one thing to mention on that, buying different fish that swim in different parts of the water column, right? You definitely want a bottom feeder. You want fish that swim in the middle of the column, and you want fish that go to the top probably. So be mindful of that as well when you're looking at stocking your community tank. All right. Another good little tip is a lot of the fish you'll see when you see them online is they're recommended in different size groups. So a lot of the things, and let me give you a couple ideas on why they're recommending groups. One, the fish is going to feel safer in a bigger group of themselves if it's required, right? Like your schooling fish. Two, if they're fish that are aggressive, you're basically divvying out the aggression from like one or two fish to like a group of fish, and it's going to be a lot less stressful, right? They're not typically chasing the one fish in the group. I mean, very rarely is that an issue, right? So you're basically dividing up what could be the aggression, which is there amongst a bigger group of fish, right? So that's why you have recommended groups a lot of times in these aquariums. It's not the sole reason, but I think it's a good starting point. So for example, a lot of our tetras, right? Buying them in groups is a good idea. Like, neons and cardinals and things like that. I even like black neons. I don't know. I'm a big tetra guy. Von Rios. I don't know. I think schooling fish that just rummy nose, those are probably my favorite. Side note of all this. It's cool to see them in groups. And I think it helps make sure everything sort of stays in balance and stays in check. So when you're looking at those fish, if they recommend them in groups and you get one, and that one barb or that one angel starts picking on it, and it has nowhere else to go, that's the fish that's going to end up getting killed, right? So be mindful of that when you're picking fish for your aquarium and what fish might pick on it in your aquarium, okay? So just keep that in mind. And then for community tanks, I don't think I would say this a lot for anything else, but I think it's important not to have varying fish that swim in the same part of the water column shouldn't be of vastly different sizes, where you have something really big and really small. And I think that would probably go well for most of everything here. You want to keep your sizes. It don't have to be the exact size. You can have something that's going to be a little bit bigger, but you don't want something to be super small. And let me give this example. It's kind of extreme, but it's a good example as a starter point. If you want to put angelfish in your in your tank, and they're larger. I wouldn't want to go to the pet store if you wanted neon tetras, and I wouldn't want to go get the neons. The neons you're going to see in a lot of your stores are going to be uber tiny. Sometimes you'll get lucky and get some large Florida ones, which are grown here, which is cool. But very rarely are they that size, and they're really small. Angels are opportunistic feeders. If they think they can get in their mouth and they can catch it, they're going to try to eat it. So mind yourself, don't do that. An alternative to that specific situation would be if you wanted to go and try cardinal tetras that are bigger, right? And you noticeably see they're bigger. Like cardinals can come in super small too, but if you see them in your like jumbo where they're large and they're over an inch, a fat chance that big angel going to catch it, right? So you're basically weighing the odds in your favor of that causing any problems. So just something to think about as far as when you're stocking this community tank, right? So that's a big, I guess, sort of a big deal. So those are my tips on your community tank for the time being. I'll probably have some more. If you've got some tips, I'd love you to leave them in the comments, talk about them, and then I like to reply, see what you guys got, see what worked for you, maybe help some other people out that are watching this video. It'd be super cool. So let me know. All right, so for your African cichlid tank, how do you qualm the aggression? Well, first thing to think about in this sense is what size are they? You're not going to have, if you're getting them as babies and you're growing them up together in the same tank, I think that's actually a really solid move. A lot of the times when the fish are creating their hierarchy, if they grow up together, they're not going to be as able to kill each other off the bat. So getting them to grow up together, one, is way more cost effective because you're not spending, my Lord, anywhere from $25 to $100 a fish. So we'll start with that in case you're curious. Two, they're a lot less to cause problems down the road because they've already solved their hierarchy problems when they were younger. And it's not always the case that way, but I think that's a good start. Having them as small, growing them up, getting when they're tiny, getting a good tank of Mbunas going is a good way to start an African cichlid tank. Now, let's say you didn't go that route and you're like, well, or let's say I have a large African tank. Now let's talk about some of your causes for issues, right? Because there's a whole, by the way, I'm trying to cover what I can think of and write down and remember and all that. There's probably more things that I'm missing. So if I am missing some things in this video, please add them, mention them. So it definitely helps some other people that are watching this video. I think, the goal of this is to be as helpful as we can. And I'm trying to get there. I'm working on this, like my second video. So help me out here a little bit. All right. Depending on where your decor is, you might have created some territories for fish, right? If you've got decor and rocks, now mind you, I guess this is a hard way to go about it. For African tanks, well, let me back up a little bit. If you're keeping Mbuna Africans, I think you're going to have a lot of rock cover because that's what they're used to. And I think that's a lot. And I think that's good for the Mbuna side of African cichlids. So they more than likely in this scenario will create territories, stuff that they're going to defend, right? That's just kind of part of it. If you want to add fish to this setting and they're already large, you're going to have to redecorate your tank to redistribute where the territories they've set up are so you can confuse them. And you can do this one of two ways. One's easier, one's not so easy. Easy way number one is before you add that fish in there, you just mix up your tank with everything else in there and then add the fish back and see what happens. Likely to confuse the fish and make them redistribute their territory, possibly their hierarchy if they're big enough, right? Number two is you can remove all the fish and all the decor and rearrange it, then add them all back at once. That's a lot more time consuming. I don't know if it's necessary a lot of the times for the Mbunas, but it's an option if it doesn't work, right? So you could do that. Okay. So for peacocks and haps and things like that, I don't find a lot of times that having a lot of rock structure is great in the tank. And what I mean by that is I mean like hiding places and things that fish can establish as kind of their own. I think having things in the tank that can obstruct view from fish, where you're not creating these structures that give them, a solid place to kind of duck in with themselves. I think give them some places that breaks line of sight is better for those types of Africans in my, tanks that I've had. So essentially what I'm talking about is keeping things, one, at least in a 75 for these types of fish. I think that's probably a must. And then keeping them relatively in the center of the tank, nothing up against walls and on the glass and things like that, where they're relatively in the center, because one, they're going to be swimming around it. And then two, it's relatively solid where it breaks that, that line of sight where that fish might not see that fish to get aggressive. And there's no territory to really divide up. You're still going to have a hierarchy, but I think it's a little safer in that direction, in my opinion. So the difference between like a territory and like an obstacle or something like an obstruction or whatever you want to call it is essentially how, where is that fish going to enter and where is that fish going to exit from that specific thing. In a territory, it can probably go in there and hide out and it can defend itself in that little place. Whereas not a whole lot it's not worried about other things attacking them from all sides, right? It's worried about coming from one direction. Whereas an obstacle, an obstruction, whatever you want to call it, is essentially just someplace it can kind of duck away and that fish doesn't see it, but it's still got to be, it still could be attacked from other sides, which means it's not trying to protect it, That's kind of, excuse me, my thought process behind that. So that's the difference between obstacles and territory. And for this specific example, I think obstacles or obstructions are better than caves and stuff like that for these fish. Okay? All right. And then obviously I've touched on this before, but I should have delved into this in the beginning, I guess, is hierarchy, right? We talked about it a little bit about Mbunas. When they're smaller, they create this hierarchy. I should have touched on that more. When the fish create this hierarchy, essentially you're going to have your tank boss, right? Your fish that is going to basically keep everything else in line. And when that's been established, right, and you're adding fish to it, you have a couple options in this situation. If the tank boss has already been established, right? Well, actually, let me back up. What happens when you start this all male African cichlid, peacock tank, and you don't have an established tank boss? Put them in there, and they're going to figure it out within the first 3 days, maybe a little longer than that, maybe a week, who's going to be the tank boss. Essentially, you'll notice it because it's one fish that's going to be the hierarchy of all of them, and it's going to keep all the other fish in check. Till eventually he gets challenged, and to where one of those two fish are going to die for that specific role, right? So that's how that sort of, what that structure means. Now, let's fast forward to you already have an established tank. You want to add another fish to this tank where you already have an established tank boss. You have a couple options. When I say a couple, I mean realistic one. I don't think I would put a fish in the tank that is bigger than the tank boss is currently. The main reason words are hard today. The main reason I say that is I think if you put a bigger fish than tank boss, is you're going to create that competition between them because they're going to realize that. Plus the other fish are going to start picking on that fish as well. I don't think you could just introduce it. I think you need a fish that's slightly smaller and no more than like maybe 3/4 of an inch difference in size. This is, by the way, this is what I've seen. This is what works for me. You could probably swing it a little bit, maybe an inch if you wanted to, but I'm just trying to make things easy, from what I've seen. So introducing it, a little bit smaller than your tank boss to where it knows where it's going to fit in the hierarchy. Otherwise, I think you could be creating some confusion and you might have to do some other things. Maybe you still have to rearrange your tank, right? Because you added that new fish and it didn't get it, right? Or it just keeps challenging the tank boss, right? So you got to be careful with that. So what do you do when you have All right, so we talked about, the causes, right? Causes of why this happens, some ideas on how to deal with it, and, the whys, right? The hierarchy, your decor could be causing your problems rather than helping your problems, right? And then now we're on to the problems is a lot of people have, I'm sure, is what do you do when they won't stop fighting? Well, you've got a couple options. Option one is you can remove the fish that's getting, beat up. Pull that out, put it in fish jail for a few days, 2 or 3 days. It's option one. Option two is you pull the tank boss out, leave that fish in there for 2 to 3 days. And then option three is you pull both fish out, leave them out for 2 to 3 days, and then reintroduce them after that and see what happens. Okay. And this could fix the problem, right? So now we've gotten to this point and nothing else has worked. We've introduced them back and it still didn't work. All right. Hopefully it worked, but if it didn't, now what do you do? Well, now your options are getting thinner on how to fix this. You've probably tried at this point, if you followed this podcast, 6 different things to make this go away. So one of the last resorts you can do is put it in another tank, right? The fish you added is getting beat up. Put it in another fish tank. Give it to a friend. Put it up on, I'm not going to try to give away any crazy secrets, but put it up to, Facebook groups for eviction, rehoming, whatever you want to call it. Offer up, Craigslist. It doesn't matter. Something like that. And then your last option is just to drop it off your pet store to get rid of it. If you're, a lot of times, if you're lucky, that store might give you some credit or something like that. Depending on the store, full transparency. In our store here, we actually don't take back fish. And it's a problem we're trying to solve. And we're a little different situation. A lot of stores is we don't just buy from the distributor. We kind of are the distributor. We import from overseas. We breed our own fish. We buy from local farms. So we don't have we don't have any extra tank space. And for everything, we try to work with a quarantine system of some kind, right? And even if we left it in one of our pet store tanks, that one fish has to take up an entire tank for X amount of days before we can introduce it, to we have a 75-gallon HAP tank, or no, I'm sorry, a 75-gallon like Peacock tank typically. And I don't want to add it into that without quarantining and viewing it and checking it out for a few days. So it's just hard for us. But a lot of other stores might be able to give you credit, but you got to take it in terms of, I don't know, like we're a store owner, and a lot of times that's the expectation is, oh, you're going to bring in the fish and we're going to exchange it for money. And a lot of times that's not how if that's your problem, you have to own it and say, well, this is the betterment for the fish, and I need to just kind of move on and move away. Maybe they'll make you a trade. Maybe they won't. I don't know. Every store is different. But just something to take into account, and don't get upset if they're like, well, I can't give you money for this, or I can't give you store credit or something like that. I don't know. That's a tough one. That's a tough one for me because here I'd like to figure out a way to make that better. And that's all right now. Just it's lack of space. That's our biggest issue is lack of space. We have so many fish in tanks and different systems, and how we take care of them is all different. And adding one fish is too much, to add to those systems. So think about that and taking it back to the pet store as your last possible resort for that. Okay. All right. So far I've done African cichlids. I've done community cichlids. What about Central and South American cichlids? What about doing those? Oh, excuse me. What about doing those fish? A lot of them are really similar to how I do the Oh, no, let's go back. All right. So one last thing I wanted to mention on the African cichlid side is stocking density. A lot of times in an open space African tank, overcrowding the tank is actually better than, It makes sense if I say this. Overstocking the tank is better than understocking the tank, right? And the main reason this is it's like similar to our community fish, right? When they do it in groups. Here we're adding more where not one fish is getting picked on, it's getting scattered throughout the many fish in the tank. And you're not having any real long-term issues with that, right? It's spreading out the aggression. Now, the downside to an overstocked African cichlid tank, especially when they're large, is you better have some prime time filtration on that beast. You don't want to have anything. To me, if you're going to overstock it, I don't think I would want to run sponge filters on it. I'd want a really big, heavy. I would run sponge as supplemental filtration, right? But really good hang-on back filters. And I'm not talking about just a big one. I'm talking about ones that actually perform as a filter. One that contains, at very least, a mechanical filter, some sort of pad in there that filters out the trash. A biofilter, something that's got some sort of biomedia or ceramic rings, whatever it is, that sort of stuff. And then if it's lucky, it might even have a bag of chemical filtration, like a bag of carbon. Those tanks that just have those filter pads that put in it, you are not doing yourself any favors like that. Maybe I'll make some videos on modifying your filters to improve its efficiency in filtering, but don't add an overstocked tank with just something like that. One, I think you're going to be paying for filter cartridges you don't need, right? So that's maybe a whole nother video, but in the short term, have some A+ 5-star filtration on that beast. That's the best I can offer you for that. So make sure you do that. Okay. Now let's move on to maybe like more of your American cichlids. So when you're keeping American cichlids in a tank, it's pretty similar to African. I won't say it's very similar to Africans. There's a lot of things to kind of take into account. One, when you're doing American cichlids, is I think the temperament in the fish have a wider range of what's a mild-mannered fish and like over the top 10, this is the most aggressive fish ever type tank. It always feels like that to me. And I always wanted to put a number scale to the different levels of fish. I think I have them in my head, what's most and least aggressive for those types of fish. But I don't want to confuse anybody, so I want to talk a little bit more generally on some ideas that could help you if you want to establish this sort of tank. And the same thing goes with, for step one, the same thing goes with what I said in the African cichlid portion. If you get them smaller, I think it still helps create that hierarchy at a younger age to where you're not having as many issues as they grow up. If they don't kill each other, they might be a little bit more aggressive, I think, at juvenile stage than maybe your Africans. But it's something I think always can help. Another good thing to think about that's maybe a little different on that I haven't mentioned. I guess I'll just talk about a few differences between the Americans and Africans that might be different. Is I think size of tank, depending on how big your fish are going to get, really matter. Like typically your Africans, outside of a few species, right, a handful of them, aren't getting incredibly massive, like 12 inches, right, 10, 12-inch cichlids. So something to really take into account is that your tank size, having a good size tank, a 125, a 250 and up for some of these big tanks, right? And you really want, for this style tank, and I'm just so I'm a little bit more specific, I'm not talking about maybe some more of the fragile species of South and Central American cichlids. Like, I'm clearly not talking about dwarf cichlids. I'm not talking about angelfish. I'm not talking about discus. Those are delicate fish that I wouldn't put in. And it just, for me, I know you can. I just wouldn't want to put them in a tank that's with more aggressive Central and South Americans. So for a fish that are going to be slightly more aggressive and large, that are going to get larger, right? So that's to give you kind of the, frame of where I'm talking about, what fish I'm talking about. That's the fish I'm talking about, right? So outside of what I've already talked about, right? Which in the Africans, I was like, okay, when you're adding fish, you don't want to add one bigger than what your tank boss in the tank's already going to be doing. right? I talked about, I guess I talk about this, and this is a good one. I don't like the idea of adding, I know this defeats the purpose for a lot of people, but if you're having issues with your tank being overly aggressive and you can't get rid of it and you're feeding them live foods, maybe start working in some more standardized diets for them. And that's kind of hard because I think that's that's one of the biggest benefits to having those sort of bigger tanks like that, is you get to see how, the aggressive level of fish and how they're eating and how excited they get for that. But I think the hyperness and all of that is going to cause the fish to be a lot more competitive. And anytime you put fish in a competitive environment where they have to compete for food, you're going to have fish starting to get more aggressive than others. And I think that could be part of the problem, right? So just trying to keep it simple here. Just like I said in the other video, I would create something to break the line of sight of the fish versus create all these little cavities for fish to get into. I don't think that actually helps at all. So bigger structures where they're not hiding underneath this and it's in a corner. It's big structures, big pieces of wood, big rocks, things like that, I think really help. And I didn't mention this before, but I've never done this, but I know a lot of people that have done this. For tanks that are incredibly aggressive, how do you qualm the tank? And I've seen a lot of people put distracting fish in there. Fish that are just overly hyper energetic. They're running around, relatively cost effective. And it's just to keep things busy and keep the fish, on their toes. And things like, I've always heard people put, giant Danios in African Cichlid tanks that are, stocked pretty heavily. I've heard them do it in South American Cichlid tanks. So that's something to think about. Put in a fish and then it's super active and it's meant to distract the fish. So that's a good idea, I think. That might be something to think about. All right. So just to wrap it up, I hope we covered a lot today. So just wanted to give some closing thoughts on this. If you've got fish that are aggressive, break down some of the different parts of the stuff we talked about on how to quell that aggression, how to stop that aggression. I think we talked about it in a bunch of different types of fish. We talked about community fish, African cichlids, American cichlids, just a lot of the same things, but maybe just a couple tweaks differently. And then see what works. Try one at a time and then go through and try the next one if it doesn't work. I know that seems more elongated and tedious, but I think it's going to help moving forward. So, all right. I think that's all I got for you today. So, awesome. Another podcast. Another podcast done. Super excited about that. I hope you guys got some content out of this. Hope you guys got some value. If you got some value, I'd love if you like on the video, like on our podcast, leave us a comment. Let me know what you guys thought. And also, I know I mentioned this earlier, if you've got things that helped you that maybe I didn't mention in this, let me know. Leave a comment, help some other people out. I'm sure they'd appreciate it. I'd appreciate it as well, because I always like learning. As much as I've been in this business, I feel like I'm still learning every day. And it's why I'm still excited about being in the business. So thanks, and I'll see you guys next time.